therapist Kristen Jacobson.
Hi, I'm Kristen, the anxiety therapist, and today I want to talk about how we're all addicts. And I don't mean in the traditional sense with drugs or alcohol, but our brains are hooked on dopamine. So I want to talk about what cheap dopamine is, how it's hijacking your brain, and what you can do about it. So dopamine is that little brain chemical that we often refer to as the feel-good hormone. The twist is that it's not always the reward itself that keeps us coming back for more. It can also be the anticipation of the reward. So if you've ever noticed how scrolling social media or checking your phone for a notification feels almost compulsive, you're not crazy. You're just running on dopamine. And while our ancestors got their dopamine hits from more survival-related things like finding food or shelter, we've now hijacked the system with what's known as cheap dopamine. And unfortunately, these prolonged or excessive dopamine spikes can have negative consequences. So in this video, I want to talk about why anticipation can be more rewarding than the actual reward, what cheap dopamine is doing to our brains and how it can contribute to anxiety, and whether we can outsmart our dopamine-hungry habits. So let's start by talking about what dopamine is and why it runs the show. So it's a neurotransmitter. Okay, but what does that mean? Well, neuro refers to the brain, and then transmitter means it transmits chemical messages within your brain. So while it's often associated with pleasure, dopamine isn't just about feeling good. It can also be about wanting to feel good. And it plays a crucial role in reward, motivation, and pleasure. So you can think of dopamine as your brain's sort of built-in reward signal. When you anticipate something exciting, like maybe watching the season finale of your favorite show, that slice of birthday cake that's waiting for you after work, or going shopping, then dopamine kicks in. It's your brain's way of saying, oh, this is going to be worth it. But here's where things get interesting. Studies have shown that dopamine can actually spike before the reward. So, in other words, sometimes the chase is more exciting than the catch. We often hear that referred to in terms of dating, right? That the chase of pursuing somebody is sometimes more rewarding than landing that first date. So let's talk a little bit about the science of anticipation and reward. So researchers have observed this effect in experiments with lab rats. When rats were trained to press a lever to receive a treat, their dopamine levels surged, not only when they ate the treat, but when they anticipated getting it. And so humans are no different. That little jolt of excitement you feel when you hear your phone buzz, that's dopamine. But when you actually check the notification and see that it's just an email from your dentist reminding you about your next appointment, well, then the reward wasn't quite as satisfying as the anticipation suggested it would be. And this creates a feedback loop. So your brain starts craving more anticipation because that's where the dopamine lives. And then suddenly you're hitting refresh on your email inbox or endlessly scrolling Instagram, hoping for that next tiny hit. So what is cheap dopamine and why is it a problem? Cheap dopamine refers to these easy, low-effort activities that trigger a dopamine release, but they don't offer any meaningful or lasting reward. So social media scrolling, binge watching Netflix, eating junk food, or playing online games, they all provide quick dopamine hits with minimal effort. But here's the catch. These quick hits don't satisfy your brain in the long run. It's like snacking on Skittles when you're actually starving, right? It might give you a sugar rush for the moment, but it's not going to fill you up. So let's talk about how cheap dopamine hijacks your brain. When you flood your brain with cheap dopamine over and over again, your dopamine receptors become less sensitive. And this is called dopamine desensitization. So what it essentially means is that you'll need more stimulation to feel the same excitement over time. So if you think about people who do abuse drugs and alcohol, they develop a tolerance, right? They need more of the drug or other substance in order to feel that same amount of euphoria or stimulation. It's the same with dopamine. And this can be why, watching one TikTok video suddenly turns into 45 minutes of scrolling, or why one Oreo somehow leads to you finishing the entire pack, right? Your brain is chasing that first dopamine hit, but it's never quite satisfied. So here's where it gets a little messy. The more you rely on these easy hits, then the less motivated you become to pursue more challenging, but really more rewarding activities like learning a new skill, finishing a project, building meaningful relationships, etc. So in short, this cheap dopamine actually makes us more lazy, distracted, and perpetually unsatisfied. And this can really create a lot of anxiety because then we're not accomplishing our goals, we're not staying focused on what we need to be doing, and we're not connecting with others in meaningful ways in person, right? It's all through these sort of cheap dopamine hits online. So what do we do about this? Well, if cheap dopamine is hijacking our brains and anticipation seems to be running the show, there are a few things that you can do to sort of sidestep this trap. One is to delay gratification. So when you put a little bit of space and time between anticipation and reward, then dopamine has time to build up in a healthier way. So for example, instead of eating a cookie immediately, wait 20 minutes. Or instead of scrolling Instagram first thing in the morning, leave your phone in another room. Delay that instant dopamine hit. You also want to pursue hard dopamine activities. And this refers to activities that require effort, but ultimately deliver a deeper sense of satisfaction. So this includes things like exercising, reading a book, cooking a meal from scratch, or working on a long-term creative project. Your brain might not get the immediate dopamine hit, that instant gratification, but the reward will feel far more satisfying in the long term. And then finally, you want to set boundaries with those cheap dopamine triggers. So social media apps, junk food, streaming platforms, they're all designed to keep you hooked, right? These developers, they study psychology and they create the algorithm to keep you locked in. So you need to be intentional about taking back control. And you can do this by setting time limits on apps. Ironically enough, there are apps for that. You can keep junk food out of the house. You can take regular digital detox days, or, if a full day isn't feasible, just do a chunk of time where you're not plugged into devices. And then you can keep things in your Amazon cart until the next day. Do you really need those wooden coasters you ordered at 2 a.m.? Probably not. So some final thoughts, just a reminder that you're not broken, you're just human. So if you've ever felt like you have no self-control when it comes to your phone or snacks or binging Netflix, it's really not because you're weak. It's because your brain is working exactly as it was designed. But understanding how dopamine works really gives you a chance to rewrite the script. And if you start noticing when you're chasing anticipation instead of actual satisfaction, then you can really pause before clicking next episode or hitting refresh on your social media feed. Because at the end of the day, dopamine really isn't the enemy. It's just a tool, and it can be used for good. And when you learn to use it intentionally, you might just find that the anticipation and the reward can both be really satisfying. So I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear from you about, kind of what your cheap dopamine traps are, and if you have any thoughts on how you can maybe set better boundaries around those. The beginning of the year is a good time to start with this. And so leave that in the comments, or if you have a question, feel free to drop that in the comments as well. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.